June 17, 1944. A basement archive room beneath Westminster, its air thick with dust, ink, and the metallic pulse of distant explosions. Margaret Ellis pressed her back against a concrete pillar as the building shuddered again, an impact somewhere above, close enough to rattle the brass fittings of the lamps swinging overhead. A thin rain of plaster sifted down over her hair, settling onto the open files spread across the floor like fallen leaves. She did not breathe. Not yet. In her left hand she clutched a thin leather folio, unassuming, easily overlooked but containing the single most dangerous document in Europe. A living catalogue of names, movements, coded references, forged identities, whispered betrayals. A blacklist more precise than anything intelligence officers or field agents had managed to assemble in the previous 4 years. The list she had built. The list they were now coming for. A siren moaned somewhere in the corridor, its echo warped by the concave stone. The lights flickered again. She steadied herself, forcing her pulse back into her chest, though it hammered like a fist demanding escape. She had been cataloging an intercepted courier pouch less than 20 minutes earlier, its contents arranged with the same meticulous geometry she once used to reshelve children's adventure books when the first explosions had rolled across the city. Not the distant tremors of another air raid. Closer, targeted. Inside the walls, someone had shouted. Boots had thundered. A guard's radio had crackled with a warning that never finished. And then the archive door had slammed open and Margaret had seen, just for a heartbeat, the unmistakable silhouette of a man who should never have been inside this building at all. A collaborator. French high-ranking. One whose name she had placed on her list only 3 nights earlier. He had seen her. His eyes had narrowed with the hateful precision of a man who recognized the person responsible for unraveling his world. And he had one hand raised, guiding others behind him. She grabbed the folio without thinking. Instinct, no fear, guided her feet as she ducked behind shelves, weaving through lantern-lit aisles until the path collapsed behind her in a storm of dust and shattered masonry. Now she crouched in the farthest corner of the sub-basement, beneath a crossbeam that groaned with the building's weight. The folio felt heavier with every passing second. Her fingertips trembled. A new sound rose beneath the constant hum of collapsing stone, the creak of a door pushed slowly open, not rushed, not panicked, controlled. They were searching. Margaret pressed her palm over her mouth to muffle her breath. Her throat burned with dust and terror. She knew the floor plan. She had mapped this archive like the back of her own hand. There were only 2 ways in or out. One lay behind the men sweeping the room, the other. Her eyes shifted. A ventilation hatch, small, rusted, half-concealed behind a low stack of unbound newspapers from 1916. She could fit through it. Maybe. Her knees dug into the cold concrete as she lowered herself onto all fours. Every slight movement sent echoes bouncing off the stone like animal whispers. The lamps above swung again, this time not from impact but from footsteps, measured, predatory, closing in. She slid toward the hatch, pushing the newspapers aside inch by painstaking inch. Each rustle felt deafening, as if she were dragging thunder across the floor. A voice cut through the room. Male, confident, speaking English with an accent sharpened by years living on the continent. "She's here, the librarian." Margaret froze. The title was spoken like a curse. Not soldier, not agent, the librarian. Another voice answered, this one closer. "Orders are to retrieve the index. She'll have it with her." Their boots shifted direction. Her heart lurched into her throat as one of them kicked aside a metal tray. It skittered across the floor, ricocheting off the pillar she had hidden behind minutes before. She had seconds. Maybe less. She forced her fingers around the edge of the ventilation hatch. It resisted. Rust clung to it like the calcified grip of a dead hand. She pulled again, harder. A metallic squeal pierced the silence. Every man in the room would have heard it. Margaret sucked in a desperate breath, one thick with mortar dust and fear, then lifted her legs, sliding into the darkness of the shaft as the lights flickered violently overhead. A shout rang out behind her. Then another. Then the crack of a gunshot splitting the air. A bullet punched into the wall inches from her heel. Heat from the impact grazed her ankle. She kicked forward, the folio clutched tight against her ribs as she crawled deeper into the metal throat of the building. The shaft vibrated with footsteps converging behind her. Another shot. Sparks. A snarl of voices. Margaret did not look back. She couldn't. Because if she stopped, if she let fear freeze her even for one heartbeat, the most dangerous blacklist in Europe would die with her in a collapsing basement in London. And the collaborators it exposed would vanish into the smoke of the war, unpunished, unnamed, free to keep poisoning the continent. Ahead the shaft narrowed. Behind the men drew closer. And the building trembled again, this time with a sound far deeper, far more final. Something was giving way. Something enormous. Before the gunfire, before the dust of collapsing stone, before any whisper of espionage, there was only a quiet girl standing between hardwood shelves in a North London library, thin, pale, and nearly invisible to the world that kept trying to forget she existed. Margaret Ellis grew up in silence, not by choice. Silence was simply the most reliable thing her childhood ever offered. Her father, a railway clerk hardened by 2 decades of British winters and one brief, unspoken stint in the Great War, spoke sparingly and drank consistently. Her mother carried a voice too soft to fill a room and a grief too persistent to ignore, the kind of grief that curled into the corners of their small home like smoke. By 10 years old, Margaret had learned to navigate life the way some children learn to cross minefields, carefully, quietly reading the air for detonations before they happened. She noticed everything, shifts in tone, subtle changes in posture, the hollow pause between a person's breath and their next sentence. She tucked these observations into the same mental grid she used for organizing the family's piles of unpaid bills and ration books. Patterns, always patterns. It was the only part of childhood she could control. School brought her no relief. She was small and bookish, the kind of girl who carried ink stains on her fingers and tucked overdue novels under her coat sleeves. Teachers praised her penmanship more often than her voice. Sharp mind, shy child, they wrote in reports her parents rarely attended to. But the library, her sanctuary, her cathedral, was the one place where she was not too quiet, not too strange, not too observant. It began when she was 12. Her mother, exhausted from a night of arguments with her father, sent her to return a stack of borrowed books. Heavy, mostly Victorian novels with cracked leather spines. Margaret placed them at the return desk with the reverence of a parishioner laying offerings at an altar. The librarian, an older woman with silver-threaded hair and spectacles always sliding down her nose, watched the girl handle the books with near-ceremonial precision. She had smiled faintly and said, "You place them as though you know where they belong." Margaret had nodded. "I do." The woman's brows lifted. "Show me." She did. She reshelved every volume perfectly without a single misstep. And when the librarian tested her slipping in a book misfiled under the wrong author, Margaret paused for only a second before sliding it into its rightful place. "Your mind is a catalog," the woman murmured. "You see order where others see piles." Those words carved themselves into Margaret's ribs. They were the first kind she had ever believed. From then on, she spent every spare hour in that library. She absorbed classification systems the way other children memorized nursery rhymes. Dewey Decimals became second nature. Cross-references thrilled her. Names, dates, subjects, origins, everything became a constellation she could map with unerring accuracy. But if the library taught her the architecture of order, home taught her something darker, the architecture of secrets. Her father's drinking grew worse during the late 1920s. He muttered names under his breath, names of soldiers he'd lost, names of men he'd hated, names of ghosts that kept tugging at him from trenches 2 decades buried. Margaret learned to listen from behind walls. She learned to piece together fractured accounts of betrayal, desertion, guilt. She learned, most importantly, that truth often lived in the margins of what people refused to say aloud. Her mother, fragile and fading, spent evenings hunched over letters from relatives in France, cousins struggling under the rising tensions that would eventually explode across Europe. Margaret would watch her fold each letter with trembling hands, carefully sealing away news she never shared with her husband. More secrets, more patterns, more fragments of a world growing unstable. When her mother died in 1933, Margaret was 23 and working full-time at the same library that had raised her. She shelved books as if returning order to a universe bent on erasing it. But grief reshaped her. It made her sharper, quieter, hungrier for structure. So when she began cataloging wartime correspondence for volunteer civilian committees in the early months of 1939, attempting to coordinate evacuation rosters and aid requests, she realized something uncanny. She could track human behavior with the same precision she tracked books. Names, movements, affiliations. Letters from one person echoing peculiar phrasing from another hundreds of miles away. Shifts in tone suggesting allegiance, fear, or duplicity. Patterns. Everywhere patterns. People dismissed her early warnings. They said paranoia, overthinking, a librarian's imagination. But she kept noticing. She kept connecting. She kept seeing the shadows before the world acknowledged the fire. And when the war finally erupted, when the country scrambled for anyone with a mind sharp enough to organize chaos into actionable intelligence, someone in the right room at the right time said her name. A civilian, a woman, a librarian. But the one person who could turn mountains of intercepted mail, coded messages, and whispered rumors into a structured, devastating truth. The making of a reluctant weapon had begun. By the winter of 1940, London had become a city of fractured nights, streets lit only by the orange bloom of fires and the brief, surgical flashes of anti-aircraft batteries carving open the sky. Margaret Ellis walked through this darkness carrying a canvas satchel filled with intercepted correspondence. She looked like any young woman navigating the blackout, collar turned up, footsteps quick, eyes low. Yet inside her satchel lay the raw nerves of Europe, letters taken from courier bags, messages seized off compromised channels, notes stripped from abandoned safe houses. Each piece was a thread, meaningless on its own, but Margaret had always been skilled at weaving what others dismissed as scraps. She had been summoned to British intelligence headquarters with no explanation, another sudden, breathless recruitment pulled from the chaos of war. She entered expecting clerical work, transcription, filing, perhaps assisting analysts who would barely remember her name. What she walked into was a room stacked floor to ceiling with intelligence material so disorganized it might as well have been kindling. 5 officers stood at a table arguing. One slammed a folder shut. Another cursed at the numbers scrawled across a map. A third waved a letter overhead shouting that the same informant had contradicted himself in 2 separate reports. Margaret stayed silent, observing the chaos the way she had once observed her parents' arguments, by reading what people didn't say. When an officer finally turned to her, his tone held only exhaustion. "You're the librarians." "Yes." He handed her a stack of files nearly as tall as her chest. "We need someone, anyone who can impose sense on this. Half our agents think everyone is lying, the other half think everyone is telling the truth. We need order, categorization." He gestured at the nightmare of papers. "Build us something we can use." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. The task sounded impossible, reckless, absurd, yet she felt something stir inside her, a quiet, steady conviction she hadn't felt since childhood. A puzzle had been dropped at her feet and she knew she could solve it. She rolled up her sleeves. And she began. At first, the officers didn't understand what she was doing. They watched her move through the room systematically, sorting documents not by geography, not by date, not by source reliability, but by something far more granular. Repeated phrases, shared metaphors, handwriting similarities, emotional tone. While others saw a pile of static, she heard the rhythm beneath. Letters written in different countries carried identical idioms, suggesting a shared origin point. Courier routes mimicked patterns she recognized from pre-war rail timetables. Someone with a railway background was orchestrating them. A cluster of correspondences from France used the same obscure grammatical structure, an indicator, perhaps, of a single ghostwriter feeding multiple collaborators. Within weeks, her desk became both sanctuary and battlefield. She slept only in brief intervals between classification frenzies, her fingers stained with ink, her mind mapping continents of betrayal like a cartographer redrawing borders after a coup. Her supervisors tested her constantly. One morning they gave her 20 letters with no dates, no signatures, no contextual notes. By noon, she had grouped them by inferred region, cross-referenced details, identified 2 false leads and flagged one as a deliberate plant. The oldest officer in the room had stared at her with something like awe. "You see people," he whispered, "as if they're books." Margaret didn't disagree. Books did not lie. Patterns did not lie. People, however, always told the truth when they didn't know someone was listening. Her rise within the intelligence unit wasn't meteoric, it was quieter, like the spreading of roots through soil. She wasn't promoted, she was simply given more files, more intercepted messages, more access, more responsibility, and more attention. Whispers began circulating about the librarian who could find collaborators by reading between lines, who could detect treachery by the tilt of handwriting. Some scoffed, others feared her. A few tried to sabotage her work, either out of jealousy or because they were hiding their own wrongdoing. She noticed them all. Patterns, after all, were her native language. But the turning point, the moment that hardened her into someone who understood how deeply this war relied on her, came in the spring of 1942. A field agent had been captured in Belgium. The intelligence unit scrambled to discover how the Germans knew his route. Dozens of analysts blamed miscommunication. Some suspected radio interception. One insisted the agent had been sloppy. Margaret read the man's final letters 3 times. Each time she stopped at the same line, a seemingly innocent sign-off referencing a person he claimed to trust. But that name appeared on other letters. Letters tied to compromised operations. Letters referencing a shadowy liaison whose allegiance wavered like a flame in a draft. She connected the pattern in less than an hour. A collaborator, hiding in plain sight. Her revelation came too late for the captured agent, but not too late for the dozens whose missions were still intact. The discovery rippled through the department. Security protocols tightened, operations recalibrated. And for the first time, someone told her directly, "Your catalog saved lives." It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like a weight dropped onto her spine. Because from that moment on, her role stopped being clerical, stopped being theoretical. She was no longer analyzing patterns. She was hunting people. And the war was about to give her the mission that would consume the next 2 years of her life, placing her directly in the line of fire. The creation of the Blacklist. The masterpiece she never wanted to build. And the one the enemy would kill to destroy. There is no turning back now. Before Margaret's Blacklist existed as a single document, before it was inked, bound, or slipped into the leather folio she'd one day clutch while running for her life, it lived as a question whispered inside closed rooms. Who in Europe can still be trusted? By late 1942, the Allies were drowning in contradictions. Reports from the continent were riddled with inconsistencies, agents turning up dead, resistance cells compromised within days of forming, entire courier chains collapsing with surgical precision. Something was wrong, something deep, something systemic. Commanders argued, intelligence officers traded accusations, no one could trace the rot. But Margaret could. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in fragments, like glimpsing reflections of the same silhouette across shattered glass. Patterns. Always patterns. A captain from Warsaw referenced a contact whose phrasing appeared again in a letter out of Lyon. A courier in Rotterdam used a route identical to one documented months earlier in Prague. And then there were the signatures, subtle loops, odd crossbars, flourishes too similar to dismiss. Different names. Same behaviors. Same omissions. A web, invisible to nearly everyone, but not to her. It took months before she worked up the nerve to walk into the briefing room, a cavernous chamber where military men with chiseled jaws and short tempers pored over maps. She waited until the noise died down, her folder clutched tightly against her ribs. "I have something to propose," she said. Most barely looked at her. She was a civilian, a librarian. A young woman with ink-stained hands in a room full of medals and cigars. But the head of the table finally gestured, "Go on." Margaret opened the folder. Inside were stacked sheets covered in color-coded annotations, cross-referenced lines, and a preliminary index she had been constructing in secret. "I believe the collaborators across Europe are not isolated. They're connected creatively, subtly, but consistently. They use shared couriers, shared phrasing, shared contacts. The connections aren't obvious unless you catalog everything. Catalog, someone scoffed. This is war, Miss Ellis, not a library. She met his eyes with a steadiness she barely recognized in herself. With respect, sir, wars have logistics. Logistics are patterns, and patterns can be tracked. The room fell quiet. She continued, voice tightening with both fear and certainty. If we build a complete ledger, a master index, we can map the collaborators' networks, predict who will be compromised next, identify which resistance groups are still intact, anticipate betrayals before they happen. She slid the sheets across the table. We can stop the bleeding. Men who had ignored her now leaned in, studying the web she'd drawn, names circled, lines connecting locations, notes about tone, handwriting, repeated details. The head of the table tapped a finger on the largest cluster. Is this accurate? Margaret nodded. More accurate than anything we currently have. Someone else murmured, if this is real, it could change the entire structure of intelligence operations. It is real, she said, but it must be comprehensive. What do you need? The question hit her like a sudden shift in gravity. What did she need? Everything. Nothing. Time. Access. A mountain of letters that others had dismissed as irrelevant. A guarantee that no one would interfere. She inhaled. Full access to all intercepted correspondence regardless of region or source. Freedom to build a new classification system, a secure archive room, and the authority to cross-examine any intelligence document without departmental barriers. The room crackled with unease. That's an enormous request. It's an enormous problem, she replied. Silence. A long one. The kind that rearranged careers. Finally, the head officer nodded. Approved. Just like that, the mission began. The setup was brutal from the first day. Her new archive room had no windows, no warmth, and constant interruptions from field officers hoping to prove her wrong. She worked in cold lamplight amid towers of paper that threatened to topple with every shift in air. The war outside roared like a wounded animal, bombs shaking the concrete, sirens slicing through her concentration, but she rarely flinched. Her mind tunneled deeper and deeper into the labyrinth of human deception. She built a towering taxonomy of names: collaborators, double agents, pretenders, opportunists, coerced individuals, and ghosts, those whose identities slipped between nations like smoke. She found patterns in the cadence of speech, in the frequency of letters, in inconsistent spelling, in emotional detachment, in codes hidden not in symbols but in absence. The list grew, became heavier, more dangerous. Then the threats began. Anonymous messages slipped under the archive door. A shadow lingering too long in the corridor. A courier found dead after delivering a packet she'd requested. Her supervisors swore the archive was secure, but she knew better. The kind of people she was uncovering did not rely on luck, they relied on infiltration. Every night she left the building with the same thought. Someone knows. By early 1944, her blacklist had become the most precise intelligence document in Europe, so precise that the Germans had begun losing collaborators faster than they could recruit them. They didn't know why, didn't know who, didn't know how. But they knew someone was bleeding them of their most valuable asset, trust. And where trust died, so did operations. The enemy set their sights on London. On the archive. On her. And when the first attack struck, targeted, deliberate, unmistakably aimed at retrieving one leather folio, she understood the truth that had been forming for months. This wasn't merely an index. It was a weapon. One powerful enough that men on both sides of the war would kill to control it. Her mission was now irreversible, unyielding, and more dangerous than anything she had imagined when she first stepped into the intelligence office as a quiet librarian. There is no turning back now. June 17, 1944. The moment Margaret slipped into the ventilation shaft, the world shrank to a metal coffin barely wider than her shoulders. The walls groaned as the building above absorbed another impact, something heavy, deliberate, not the random cruelty of an air raid. This felt personal, targeted, designed to bury her along with the names she carried. Dust choked the shaft. Her palms scraped along jagged seams as she pulled herself forward inch by inch, the leather folio pinned between her chest and the cold steel. Every movement echoed, a hollow clank, a whisper of friction, a metallic scream threatening to betray her position. Behind her, boots pounded against the concrete. The collaborators' escort had entered the archive. Their voices swelled, fractured by the metal walls, growing closer with each heartbeat. "Check the back corridors. She's in here somewhere, she couldn't have cleared the stairs. Find the list." Shouts ricocheted like gunfire. Margaret exhaled shakily, trying to calm the trembling in her limbs. She had catalogued entire nations' worth of secrets under the cold pressure of wartime intelligence, but this was survival stripped of theory. This was the realization that her mind, her work, her quiet talent had become lethal currency. She crawled deeper. The shaft angled downward. Then right. Then narrowed again. When she reached the junction, she paused, listening. Her breath fogged the metal, sweat cooled beneath her collar. She heard two distinct sets of footsteps below, directly under the vent grill. If she dropped down, she'd land almost on top of them. If she kept crawling, she'd reach the dead-end plating near the boiler room. Trapped either way. A tremor rolled through the building, far stronger than the earlier blasts. Something above had collapsed. Heat surged toward her like breath from a furnace. The archive was burning. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind. Not about death, she'd accepted its possibility long ago. What terrified her was the idea that the list might die with her. The names inside it would scatter back into the shadows. Collaborators would resurface. Resistance networks would be severed before they ever had a chance to rise. London would recover from ruins. But Europe could not recover from a second wave of betrayal. She closed her eyes, gathering herself the way she once steadied trembling library carts. One thought move. Margaret gripped the grate. One twist. 2. 3. It rattled loose. She lowered it quietly as voices drifted upward, French, clipped and urgent. She must be above, spread out. The folio, she'll have it on her. Shoot if she runs. Margaret lowered herself through the vent, hanging by her fingertips before dropping silently onto a shelf of boxed records. The wood groaned beneath her weight but did not break. She froze, breath suspended. Below, two men walked between rows of shelves, rifles drawn, eyes scanning for movement. She watched them from above, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could see their faces clearly, one young, jaw clenched with fear, the other older, composed, the kind of man who had betrayed dozens with a steady hand. The older one paused, sensing something, his gaze lifted. Margaret flattened herself against the top shelf, fingers gripping the folio so hard the leather cut into her palm. The man studied the ceiling. A long beat. Then another. He turned away. "Check the west corridor," he ordered. They moved on. Margaret let out a slow, silent breath. Her muscles trembled violently, but she forced herself to climb down, boots landing softly on the concrete. She pressed her back against the shelves, adjusting the strap of the folio beneath her coat. She needed to reach the East Service tunnel. It was narrow, half-flooded, and likely unstable after the blasts, but it led outside the building. If she made it there, she had a chance. She slipped through the shadows, weaving between stacks of intelligence files that smelled of mildew and old ink. Each step was measured, toes first, weight distributed through her heels the way she'd been taught by a covertops instructor months earlier, an instructor who had laughed at the idea of a librarian needing field training. She could hear his voice now. Quiet feet save loud minds. When she reached the main corridor, it was half-collapsed, bricks scattered across the floor like bones. Smoke drifted from the far end. The air tasted of plaster and burning paper. Suddenly, a silhouette emerged from the smoke. Tall, armed. He saw her. His eyes widened. Gun rising. Margaret didn't think. She dove behind a toppled cabinet as the first shot exploded against the stone wall, sending fragments slicing past her cheek. She landed hard, pain flaring through her ribs, but adrenaline kept her crawling forward. Another shot. Then another. She slid into the narrow side passage, sprinting toward the service tunnel door. Her boots splashed through water pooling across the floor. She reached the door handle, turned. Locked. Footsteps pounded behind her. Her mind raced through every possibility, every pattern, every detail of the building she had memorized. The lock was a basic maintenance issue, old, barely reinforced. She raised her elbow and drove it into the metal latch. Pain shot up her arm. She hit it again. The latch bent, gave way. The door flew open. She stumbled inside just as the gunman's shadow filled the hall. Bullets tore through the frame as she slammed the door shut, plunging into the darkness of the tunnel. Outside, the world rumbled with the collapse of the archive that had held her work, her war, her identity. But the list was still in her hands. Still alive. Still capable of reshaping the future of Europe. She ran deeper into the darkness. Toward escape. Toward the final choice that would define everything. The service tunnel emptied into the night like a wound torn open beneath the city. When Margaret emerged, soaked to the ankles and shaking from exhaustion, London breathed around her in uneasy silence, buildings leaning in the dark, fires guttering in distant streets, the sky thick with smoke not yet dispersed by the wind. She pressed her back to the brick wall, clutching the leather folio against her chest as if it were a fragile organ she was afraid to drop. Her heartbeat thudded dully in her ears. Not triumph. Not relief. Just the raw, animal instinct of a person who has outrun death by seconds. She stood there for a moment, letting the cold air cool the sweat on her neck, letting her lungs relearn how to inhale without trembling. But even as she steadied herself, she knew the night wasn't over. The men hunting her would not stop at the archive. They would search the streets. They would follow any rumor, any trail, any shadow that might suggest where she'd fled. She pushed off the wall and began walking, slow enough to avoid attention, fast enough not to be swallowed by the dread still stalking her heels. The folio grew heavier with every block she crossed. Beneath its worn leather cover lay the names of hundreds, collaborators, sympathizers, opportunists, and traitors stitched across the continent. People who had sold secrets for safety. People who had condemned others to death. People who had shaped the invisible war moving beneath the visible one. For 2 years she had held their identities like lanterns in a dark room. Tonight, the darkness had finally reached for her. She reached a quiet residential street, the kind where the blackout curtains were drawn so tightly they seemed to hold the houses together. She ducked between 2 garden walls, dropped to her knees, and pried loose a cobblestone still warm from the day's sun. Beneath it lay a small metal tin, one she'd placed there weeks ago, just in case. Inside the tin were 3 items: a new ration card, a forged employment pass, and the insignia badge of a civil repair worker. A disguise, one of many cached around the city in preparation for a night like this. She pinned the badge to her lapel and slipped back into the street, face lowered, posture shaped into the tired slump of a worker heading home after a long shift. No one stopped her, no one looked twice. But even as she moved through the dark, the truth settled into her bones. The archive was gone. The building that had held her life's work, her maps of betrayal, her threads of truth, had collapsed into rubble. If the list in her hands was lost, there would be no backup, no reconstruction. Europe would bleed in ways no one would fully understand until it was too late. She reached the river. Fog rolled off the water, swallowing sound and reshaping the night into something ghostly. She leaned against the railing, staring at the warped reflection of the city lights in the ripples below. A strange calm settled over her. She had done the impossible, she had survived. But survival came with its own price. The faces of the men she'd seen in the archive, men who'd hunted her with cold precision, flashed in her mind. Their rage, their certainty, they weren't just protecting themselves. They were defending an entire system of shadows she had spent years illuminating, and because of that illumination, they'd come for her. The war would end one day, but the consequences of her work, they would linger. Years from now, when tribunals convened and occupation governments fell, her list would resurface. Names would be read aloud, trials would be built around the fragments she had preserved. Families would learn truths they had never suspected. Some reputations would burn, some legacies would be rescued, some histories would crack open like old stone. And Margaret, quiet, steady, invisible Margaret, would live with the knowledge that she had held the power to define those futures. A soft wind carried smoke across the riverbank. Somewhere behind her, a siren began to wail. She straightened, tucked the folio inside her coat, and turned away from the water. The city needed her to disappear for a while, to hide, to keep the blacklist alive until it could be delivered into the right hands. She stepped into the fog, each footprint swallowed by the next. She did not look back. Not at the river. Not at the burned shape of Westminster silhouetted against the night. Not at the life she had abandoned to become the archivist of shadows. Some wars were fought with guns. Hers had been fought with names, and the weight of those names would live with her for the rest of her life. Because history doesn't remember the quiet ones, but history is built by them. If you want more stories like this, hidden battles, unseen heroes, and the untold machinery of war, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. It helps bring these forgotten histories back into the light.